Hi, my name's Lisa Tran, 27 years old, and I have just graduated with an MBA from Stanford, a milestone I earned with blood, tears, and years of relentless hard work. Yet, at my graduation dinner, as friends, professors, and colleagues sat around the table waiting to hear my parents say one proud word about me, the only thing they did was turn to praise my younger sister. They repeated the same refrain I had heard all my life. Vanessa is our pride, the doctor who saves lives, while Lisa is just a girl behind a desk. I tried to stay calm, but when a colleague asked if they must be proud of my achievements, my parents only gave a dismissive laugh. That night, for the first time in my life, I stood up and pushed back. I laid out everything I had done, sending money home to cover bills, paying Vanessa's tuition, carrying the weight of the family for years. And then I asked directly, if I'm as worthless as you say, then who has been keeping this family standing all these years? In anger, they unleashed the cruelest words of all. We wish we had never given birth to such a disrespectful daughter. From that moment on, I decided to cut all ties and rewrite my life on my own terms. Have you ever felt dismissed by your own family, denied your worth on a day that was supposed to be your happiest? If so, share your thoughts with me and let me know where you are listening from, so I'll know I'm not alone. From a young age, I grew up in a household where comparison was the invisible air that filled every meal and every conversation. I remember clearly how much I loved math and economics back in high school, how numbers made me feel safe, logical, and in control. I studied diligently, earned high scores, and was even chosen to compete on the school's academic team. But whenever I brought home a certificate of achievement, my mother would only shrug and say, "That's nice. But it's nothing compared to saving lives as a doctor." Those words cut like a tiny blade, not enough to make me cry right away, but repeated so often they turned into scars on my heart. Meanwhile, Vanessa, my younger sister, was celebrated like a star even as a teenager. All she had to do was earn an A in biology and the whole family would throw a party. All she had to do was say she dreamed of becoming a doctor, and my parents would retell that story to friends and relatives as if she alone carried the hope of our entire bloodline. Birthdays were the clearest proof of that difference. I remember one year when my sister and I shared a birthday party. The large cake on the table had only the words, "Happy Birthday, Vanessa," written in bright red frosting. My name was added in tiny, messy letters in the corner, so faint that many guests jokingly asked, "Oh, is it Lisa's birthday too?" I forced a smile and said it was fine, that I was used to it. But inside, my heart ached. I knew I was nothing more than a shadow standing next to a shining star, never bright enough to be truly seen. When I entered college, I chose economics partly out of passion, partly because I knew I needed a career that would allow me to stand on my own quickly. I didn't want to be a burden on my parents. From freshman year, I took on jobs, making coffee in a small shop, typing data for a law office, even tutoring neighborhood kids in math just to earn some extra money. I learned to balance classes, assignments, and late-night shifts. Meanwhile, Vanessa only had to focus on studying because every expense was covered by me and my parents. I didn't blame her. I thought that was what an older sister was supposed to do. But deep down, I still longed for my parents to acknowledge, just once, that without me, my sister would never have been able to fully pursue her dream of becoming a doctor. I remember the day I brought home my very first paycheck, my heart swelling with happiness, hoping my parents would tell me how proud they were that their daughter could already provide for herself right out of school. But my father only gave a cold nod and said, "That's good. If you have money, send more to your sister. She needs to buy a new set of medical textbooks." In that moment, my joy was extinguished. It felt as though all my effort meant nothing, as if I existed only as a wallet to be opened for my sister. From then on, my role in the family seemed to be reduced to two words: obligation. The obligation to provide, the obligation to sacrifice, the obligation to stay silent. Many times, friends would ask me if I ever felt hurt being constantly compared like that. I would just smile and say I was used to it. I kept telling myself that if I stayed quiet worked hard, and achieved enough, eventually my parents would have to change the way they saw me. I believed success was the only answer. So I gritted my teeth, swallowed every ounce of bitterness, and kept pushing forward without pause. That was also why I chose to pursue an MBA, a degree I thought would finally make my parents lift their heads with pride whenever my name was mentioned. I carried that fragile hope for years, despite a past filled only with repeated disappointments. And it was that very hope that made me walk into my graduation dinner with a heart both trembling and desperate, wishing that today would finally be the day they looked at me differently with eyes of recognition. The dinner began in a lively atmosphere, soft music flowing from the corner of the room, warm lights falling over the tables covered in crisp white cloth. I stood at the entrance, introducing my parents one by one to colleagues from my company and friends who had been by my side through 2 intense years of graduate school. Many people came up to shake my parents' hands, complimenting them on having such a remarkable daughter, saying that graduating with an MBA from Stanford was an achievement few could ever reach. I looked at my parents, hoping to see even a flicker of pride in their eyes, but all I saw were forced smiles and shallow nods. Then my thesis advisor walked over, starting a conversation, praising me as a hardworking, intelligent student with sharp thinking skills, saying he trusted I would go far in my career. I bowed my head slightly to thank him, but inside I was waiting, almost breathless, for my parents' reaction. This should have been the moment they heard words of praise about me, the moment they finally smiled with pride. But instead, my mother leaned in and said to my professor, "Yes, she is hardworking, but our youngest daughter is the real pride of our family. She's in medical school, working shifts at the hospital every day, saving lives, not just sitting behind a desk like Lisa." I froze, but I forced myself to keep smiling. A few of my colleagues furrowed their brows, clearly surprised by the way my mother belittled me in the middle of my own celebration. My cheeks burned hot, as if every eye in the room had turned on me, but I kept telling myself, just endure a little longer, they can't keep doing this forever. Then, one of my classmates stood up, raised a glass, and said that I was an inspiration to many people because I had managed to work while completing such a demanding program, always achieving excellent results. The whole table applauded, and some even called my name out loud. I turned toward my parents, waiting for the moment they would finally smile, pat my shoulder, and say they were proud of me. But instead, my father gave a faint chuckle and replied with words that crushed me inside. "Yes, she's smart, but compared to Vanessa, it's still nothing. Vanessa is out there saving lives every day. Being the parents of a doctor, that is what real pride feels like." The table fell silent for a moment, the air suddenly heavy. I swallowed hard, raising my glass awkwardly, but inside it felt like a stone was pressing down on my chest. I knew they were used to making comparisons, but I never imagined that on my special day, right in front of professors, friends, and colleagues, they still couldn't give me the slightest recognition. I heard whispers from the next table, saw a few colleagues shake their heads, though they quickly turned to laugh again so I wouldn't feel more embarrassed. I pressed my lips together, holding it in, repeating silently to myself, "Just let it be patient a little longer, and one day they will have no choice but to see my true worth." During the main part of the dinner, my direct manager from the company stepped up to give a speech. He spoke about my journey at work, how I had taken on difficult projects, never hesitated to work through the night, and had saved the entire team from failure more than once. He emphasized that I was one of the most outstanding young employees, and that the company expected me to be promoted very soon. As he said that, the whole room erupted in applause, with a few people even whistling to congratulate me. My heart warmed, and I was certain this time my parents would finally feel proud. But when I turned to look at them, I caught the cold expression in my mother's eyes. She leaned toward the person sitting next to her and whispered, "Being good at making money is still just about making money. But being a doctor, that's a noble profession, something worth showing off." It felt like a bucket of cold water poured over me. The smile on my lips faltered, and my throat tightened. I tried to hide the pain, continued chatting with guests, but inside I was tearing apart. I asked myself why all my efforts were always diminished, Why, no matter what I achieved, my parents only saw me as a walking wallet. Every time they mentioned Vanessa, their eyes lit up, their voices filled with pride. But when it came to me, all they had were dismissive jokes and indifference. A little later, a younger colleague, perhaps unaware of the tension, innocently asked my parents, "You must be so proud of Lisa, achieving something like this. Graduating with an MBA from Stanford isn't easy at all." The entire table turned to look at my parents, waiting for an answer full of pride. In that moment, I held my breath too, longing just once to hear the words, "We're proud," come from their lips. But all I received was a detached glance and a faint smile. My mother shrugged and said flatly, "Well, it's fine, I suppose." My father shook his head, then quickly turned the conversation to Vanessa's night shifts at the hospital, bragging that their youngest daughter was saving lives every day, and that compared to a doctor, an MBA degree meant nothing. My chest tightened, the anger rising all the way to my throat. For years, I had endured those comparisons, swallowed my tears, and convinced myself that if I just stayed patient and worked harder, one day they would change. But right here, on the most important day of my life, in front of friends, colleagues, and professors, they once again belittled me as if all my efforts meant nothing. Humiliation and pain surged through me, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I set my glass down on the table, the chair scraping with a sharp sound that made everyone turn their heads. I stood up, my hands trembling, but my voice rang out louder than I expected, even to myself. Do you want to know what I had to do to get here? To wear this graduation gown today, I worked and studied non-stop for years. I took jobs from the time I was still in college so I wouldn't become a burden. I sent home every bit of my first paychecks to cover the electricity and water bills when you were struggling. I carried Vanessa's tuition through all her years in medical school so she wouldn't have to give up her dream. I signed off hospital expenses, cut down my own rent and food just to help this family survive. And yet today, on the day I thought you would finally be proud of me, all I receive is still comparison and ridicule? The room froze. The background music seemed to vanish, leaving only the pounding of my heartbeat and my heavy breaths. I pressed on, my voice stronger now, no longer shaking. If I am as worthless as you say, then who has kept this family standing all these years? Who has sacrificed in silence so Vanessa could chase the dream you boast about every single day? If I truly mean nothing, then why is it that whenever this family faced trouble, the first person you called was always me? My parents sat there, their faces flushed with embarrassment. I could see the confusion in their eyes as they realized every word I said was true. But instead of admitting it, they looked around the room, saw my colleagues and friends watching, saw the mixture of shock and discomfort on their faces. Perhaps they felt exposed, humiliated in the very place where they expected to hold their heads high. And in their anger, they spoke the words that I know I will never forget for as long as I live. My father's voice was sharp, each word falling like a cold blade. "We wish we had never given birth to such a disrespectful daughter." 1. The air shattered. I heard the shocked gasp of a colleague, the clatter of a spoon dropping onto the table somewhere nearby. The room was suffocatingly silent, so heavy that even breathing felt unbearable. I stood frozen, my heart clenched as if in a vice, my vision blurring for a moment. But then, in the middle of that pain, something inside me ignited. I realized this was their true nature. They would never acknowledge my sacrifices, and worse, they were willing to deny my very existence simply because I dared to defend myself. I lifted my head, forcing my voice to stay steady. I looked straight at my parents, then around the room at all the eyes watching, and I spoke slowly, each word carved into the air. "If that is what you wish, then consider me as if I never existed. Live your lives as though there was never a daughter named Lisa." IDAC. A wave of murmurs rippled across the dinner table. My friends were stunned, some looking at me with eyes full of sympathy, while a few colleagues shook their heads in disbelief. My professor furrowed his brow, clearly shaken. My parents stayed silent, saying nothing more, their faces lowered in a mix of anger and humiliation. I felt my whole body grow lighter, as though I had finally shed a weight that had clung to me for years. Without waiting for another reaction, I quietly picked up my bag, turned, and walked away under the stunned gaze of everyone still frozen in their seats. The sound of my heels striking the floor echoed through the silent room, like the final declaration ending a relationship that had long since rotted from within. I stepped out of the restaurant on trembling legs, feeling as though the world itself had just collapsed. My parents' cold words still rang in my head, words I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. "We wish we had never given birth to such a disrespectful daughter." My chest tightened, my breath ragged and uneven. I stumbled along the Palo Alto sidewalk, the dim streetlights casting long, distorted shadows behind me. Every breath felt like a blade twisting deeper into my heart, and yet, strangely, beneath the pain, I felt something breaking loose, not just my heart, but the invisible chains that had bound me for so many years. By the time I returned to my small apartment in San Francisco, the clock was nearing midnight. My phone buzzed nonstop with dozens of missed calls and messages. News from the dinner had spread quickly throughout the company. A few close colleagues texted to say how sorry they were to witness what happened, but also how courageous I had been to stand up and speak the truth. One even wrote that I had spoken for so many others, people who had spent their lives belittled by their families yet had never once dared to fight back. I read those messages through tears, feeling both humiliated and strangely relieved. At least now, my truth had been spoken. No longer hidden beneath the mask of obedience I had forced myself to wear all these years. But mixed in among the messages were dozens of missed calls from my parents. They called nonstop, as if determined to force me to answer. When I finally picked up, my mother's voice came through, trembling with rage. "You humiliated us in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what people will think? They'll say we failed to raise our child, that our daughter is disrespectful and ungrateful." Each word scraped against my heart like salt on an open wound. But this time, I didn't cry, and I didn't beg for their recognition. I answered calmly, my voice steady and low. I only spoke the truth. "You're not ashamed because of me, you're ashamed because of what you've done." The line went quiet for a few seconds, and then my father cut in, his tone sharp and furious. "Who do you think you are to stand up and criticize us? Have you forgotten who raised you, who gave you everything? Without us, do you think you'd be where you are today?" I clenched my teeth, my eyes blurring with tears, but my words came out firm and unshaken. "Without me, do you think this family would have survived all those financial struggles over the years? Without me, would Vanessa have made it through medical school so smoothly, the very dream you brag about every chance you get? If I was only a burden, then why was I always the one you called whenever you needed money?" My words left the other side in silence. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the sound of their heavy breathing. Then my mother spoke again, her voice dripping with disdain. "Don't forget, you still carry the Tran name. No matter where you go, you're still our daughter." I closed my eyes, and with the weight of years of pain pressing inside me, I replied simply, "Number. From now on, live as if I never existed." I hung up, my hands still trembling, but for the first time in my life, my chest felt strangely light. The next morning, I woke up in my quiet room, the early sunlight streaming through the window. My phone buzzed again with messages, some filled with blame, others with relatives urging me to apologize to your parents and keep the peace. But I knew the truth. Once you've been cursed as a child who should never have existed, there is nothing left to repair. I opened my laptop, logged into my bank account, and for the first time in years, I stopped every automatic transfer to their household. I canceled the payments for electricity, water, and internet bills I had been covering in silence. I ended the monthly allowance I had been sending to Vanessa. My fingers trembled as I hit confirm, but, inside, a stronger voice rose within me. Enough. It is time to live for myself. That afternoon, I walked along the San Francisco Bay. The cold wind brushed against my face, carrying the salt of the sea. I thought about everything I had endured, the sleepless nights, the cruel remarks, the times I swallowed tears just to keep smiling. I used to believe all of it was a stepping stone, that one day I would finally be acknowledged. But now, I understood that recognition would never come. And it no longer needed to. My worth had never been in my parents' eyes, it had always been in me, in what I built with my own hands. Back at my apartment, I opened the notebook where I kept my goals and reminders to myself. I wrote a single line, both a vow and a promise. From today, Lisa Tran will live a new life. No longer chained by contempt, no longer bound by obligation. From now on, I live for me. That night, as I looked out the window at the city glowing under thousands of lights, I knew a new chapter had begun. It would not be easy, but for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of freedom in my heart. And I told myself, even if I must walk alone, the road ahead will still be the road I choose. After that night of severing ties, I went through a period of emptiness, but slowly, I learned to fill that void with my own determination. I threw myself into work as a way to keep from collapsing. My company was in a phase of expansion, constantly taking on strategic consulting projects from major corporations. I volunteered for extra assignments, stayed in the office late into the night, and no longer felt the exhaustion I once did when my mind was divided between work and family. Now, all of my energy was devoted to myself and the career I had chosen. And within just a few months, those efforts were rewarded. My superiors entrusted me with managing a multi-million-dollar project. It succeeded beyond expectations. The client was so satisfied they signed on for more, and I became one of the most outstanding young managers in the company. The news spread quickly within the industry. For the first time, the name Lisa Tran was no longer tied to family comparisons, but to one word in the eyes of colleagues and clients: success. I decided to give myself a well-earned reward. After years of renting a tiny apartment in the suburbs, I bought my own place in downtown San Francisco. It wasn't a grand mansion, but it was a space where I could open the window and look out at the bay shimmering in the afternoon light. Every square foot of that apartment was the result of my own hands, not anyone else's. I furnished it exactly the way I wanted. A large gray sofa where I could curl up with a book, a few green plants to fill the room with life. I still remember the moment I held the keys in my hand and stepped through the door for the first time. I broke down in tears, not from sadness, but because, for the first time, I felt truly free, truly in possession of a space that was mine alone. To mark this turning point, I hosted a small gathering in my new home. I invited my closest friends, a few colleagues who had shared those long, grueling nights at the office, and even my thesis advisor from Stanford, the one who believed in me when my own parents did not. That evening, the room glowed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the warmth in everyone's eyes. We sat on the floor with steaming pizzas, reminiscing about silly memories from school and sharing our plans for the future. No one compared me to anyone else. No one belittled my work. They saw me simply as a friend, a colleague, a person worthy of respect and affection. In that moment, I suddenly remembered my MBA graduation dinner. The cold faces of my parents, their belittling words, the heavy atmosphere pressing down on my chest, all of it stood in stark contrast to the joy surrounding me now. I looked around the bright, laughter-filled room and wondered why I had wasted so many years chasing recognition that was never going to come. The truth was, my worth had never been in my parents' eyes. It was here, with the people around me, the ones who chose to stay, not because of blood, but because they truly valued me. After the party, when the room was quiet except for the faint scent of wine and empty pizza boxes left on the table, I stood by the window looking out over the city. The streetlights stretched into endless lines of glowing trails, and the wind from the bay carried the taste of salt through the air. I whispered to myself, I am worthy. I am worthy of love, of respect, and I don't need anyone's permission to exist. From that day forward, I stepped into life with a new mindset. I focused more on the things that made me happy instead of what others expected of me. I devoted time to learning new skills, challenging myself with international projects. I traveled with friends, trips I had once been too afraid to take because I felt I always had to save money to send home. I learned to enjoy the rewards of my work without feeling guilty. And most of all, I learned to let go of the hopeless desire that my parents would ever change. Life in this new chapter wasn't always easy. There were nights when I still broke down in tears, haunted by the curse hurled at me on my graduation night. But whenever I felt weak, I thought back to the small gathering in my new apartment, to the sound of laughter ringing out, to the warmth of hugs from people who truly cared. That was the family I had chosen, the family I deserved. And I knew then that I had found the strength to keep moving forward, not as the daughter forever looked down upon, but as Lisa Tran, a free, independent woman who finally knew her own worth. A few months after I began this new life, when peace had slowly become my habit and it seemed the door to the past had closed for good, my parents suddenly appeared at my apartment door. That afternoon, I had just come back from the office, still holding my work bag, when I heard the pounding of persistent knocks. When I opened the door, I froze. Both of my parents were standing there, faces tense. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. They stepped in without waiting for me to invite them, moving as if this apartment somehow belonged to them, as if I were still the daughter expected to obey without question. My mother set her handbag on the table, sighed heavily, and began with the kind of tone that signaled a difficult story. "Lisa, the family is in trouble. Vanessa. She's been temporarily suspended because the hospital is cutting staff. She needs money to keep paying for her specialty program. You know, if a doctor drops out now, it ruins everything." I sat down on the sofa, crossed my arms, and looked directly at them. Inside me stirred a mix of bitter amusement and sadness. I remembered with perfect clarity how, only a few months earlier, at my own graduation dinner, they had looked me in the eye and said the cruelest words. "We wish we had never given birth to such a disrespectful daughter." And now, when faced with hardship, they had come to the very daughter they once denied. Keeping my voice calm, refusing to let anger control me, I asked, "You came here to ask me for money, didn't you?" My father cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes, but his voice came out like an order. "You're our daughter, and it's your duty to help the family. No matter what, Vanessa is still your sister. She's the future, the hope of this household. You have money, so why wouldn't you help?" Each word carved deeper into my memory, echoing all the years I had been dismissed and used. They hadn't come to apologize, hadn't come to admit their mistakes. To them, I was still nothing more than a money machine, and now that the machine had dared to switch off, they were desperate to turn it back on. I looked at them and replied slowly, "Duty? I've fulfilled the duty of a daughter for more than 10 years. I've paid the bills, covered tuition, signed off on hospital expenses, even cut my own living costs just to send money home. And how did you repay me? By humiliating me on my graduation day, in front of my friends and colleagues. You said I wasn't worthy, even wished I had never existed. Well, from that moment, I stopped belonging to this family." My mother's face drained of color, and she shot back immediately, her voice trembling with fury. "How can you say such things? Blood is blood. No matter how much we fight, you'll always be our daughter. You owe us for bringing you into this world." I let out a faint, bitter smile, feeling that old familiar pain, now mingled with an unshakable resolve. "No, I owe you nothing. On the contrary, you owe me for the years I carried this family through its debts, for the nights I worked myself to exhaustion to send money home, for the youth I sacrificed to hold everything together, only to be cursed in return." My father slammed his hand on the table, growling, "You're ungrateful. If outsiders heard this, they would laugh at us." I stayed calm and answered, "Outsiders have already heard, and they didn't laugh at me. They laughed at the way you treated your own daughter." Then I stood up, walked to the door, and pointed outside. "If you came here to apologize, I would listen. But if you came only to demand money, then I'm sorry that ended the night you disowned me." The air in the room was heavy as stone. My mother gripped my father's sleeve, trying to pull him away, but before leaving, she turned back, her eyes sharp with venom. "You'll regret this. One day you'll realize you need your family." I gave a faint smile, my voice calm. "I already have a family, just not you." The door closed behind them, leaving silence in its wake. I stood there, breathing hard, but inside I felt a lightness I had never known before. This was the second confrontation, and the first time I had looked my parents in the eye without fear. I had dared to speak everything out loud, dared to cut away the invisible chains that had bound me for so many years. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes, to find freedom, we must have the courage to confront the very people we once loved the most, but who also hurt us the deepest. After that fierce encounter, I knew I never wanted to repeat another argument with them again. There was no need to shout, no need to prove anything directly, because the truth was already clear. In my parents' eyes, I would never be enough. But in the eyes of the world, I could define my own worth. So, one late evening, sitting before my laptop in my new apartment, I opened LinkedIn and began to write. I didn't use names, I didn't point fingers directly, but I shared the story of a daughter who had been belittled by her own family, compared endlessly, treated as nothing more than the household's wallet. I wrote that instead of giving up, she chose to stand tall, work relentlessly, and ultimately build success with her own hands. I ended with a single line. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop seeking recognition from those who will never see your worth. Write your own story instead. When I hit the publish button, I didn't expect much. I only thought I needed to let it out, to record it as a reminder to myself never to walk the old path again. But overnight, the post exploded with thousands of likes, shares, and comments. The next morning, I opened my phone and was stunned to see my inbox overflowing with messages from strangers. Some were office workers looked down on by their families for not choosing a noble profession. Some were artists dismissed as unstable. Others were simply children who had never once heard the words, "We're proud of you," from their parents. They wrote to me, saying they saw themselves in my story, that they cried when they read the line, "Stop seeking recognition from those who will never see your worth." I read every message, tears streaming down my face, and for the first time in my life, I felt I was not alone. The ripple spread far beyond my control. Many leaders in the consulting industry reshared my post, calling it a powerful message about resilience and leadership. My company took notice, and instead of criticizing me, they valued it. The head of HR personally called me into her office and said they were impressed by how I turned a painful personal story into an inspiring lesson for the community. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at a major conference on resilience and leadership in San Francisco. I stood on stage before hundreds of people, recounting my journey in a voice calm yet resolute. When I finished, the hall erupted in applause. In that moment, I realized I didn't need my parents' recognition. I had found recognition elsewhere in myself, and in the strangers who understood. Of course, the news eventually reached my parents. I heard through relatives that they were furious, terrified that my post might lead people to guess the truth. But they didn't dare speak out publicly because they knew that if they did, they would only expose themselves. I could picture them sitting in the living room, seething as they watched me being celebrated on social media and in professional circles, unable to do anything but swallow their anger. That was the sweetest revenge. I didn't need to tear them down, didn't need to shout or curse. All I had to do was live well, succeed, and let the world see the truth for itself. That night, after returning from the conference, I opened the door to my apartment, slipped off my heels, and poured myself a glass of red wine. I sat on the sofa, gazing at the city lights reflecting through the window. I thought of my parents, of the venomous words they had once spat at me, and then I thought of the thousands of strangers who had written to thank me for daring to speak out. In that moment, I found myself smiling. Revenge, I realized, didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes silence, persistence, and success were the most powerful forms of revenge. As time passed, my career seemed to take flight. The projects I led brought in massive revenues for the company, and before long, I became one of the most promising young managers in the industry. Trade journals began to mention my name as a model of the new generation of leaders, resilient, decisive, and innovative. I still remember the feeling of walking into the conference room to sign the first multi-million-dollar contract of my life. My hands no longer trembled the way they once had in front of my parents. They were steady, confident. When the signing was done, the entire project team stood to applaud, and the director shook my hand firmly. Lisa, you haven't just changed the game for this company, you've changed the standard for the entire field. That was the moment I realized the recognition I once begged for from my family, I had already found in a far better, fairer place. My apartment changed with me. From a modest space, I was now able to buy a larger home with a wide view of the bay, where every morning sunlight poured in through the open glass windows. I no longer hesitated to reward myself with good things, because I knew every dollar came from my own sweat and effort. Business trips took me to major cities, where I met people I had once only read about in books and magazines. They listened to my story, invited me to collaborate, and respected my abilities. Each compliment, each handshake felt like a sweet blade carving itself into my memory. Lisa Tran, the daughter once rejected, now stepping onto the world stage. Meanwhile, on the other side, my parents and Vanessa began to struggle. Without the monthly support I had always sent, they slowly sank into debt. I heard from a relative that the bank had already sent foreclosure warnings on their house due to late payments. Vanessa, who had been pampered all her life and never learned to take care of herself, now stumbled under the weight of her own expenses. The hospital where she interned had cut staff, and her chances of advancement grew increasingly slim. I didn't feel glee, but I didn't feel pity either. Everything they were going through was simply the result of the choices they once held so proudly. Then the emails started coming. At first, they were short, accusatory lines rather than pleas. Are you really going to abandon your family? Later, as hardship pressed harder, the tone shifted to begging. Vanessa desperately needs you, the family is falling apart, if you have any love left, please help. I read them all, but I never replied. I remembered that moment at my graduation dinner, when they looked me in the eye and spat out the cruel words, "We wish we had never given birth to such a disrespectful daughter." That sentence erased every obligation, freeing me from the burden of being the dutiful daughter I had carried for so many years. When I didn't respond, they began reaching out through relatives. An aunt called me, her voice full of reproach. "No matter what, they're still your parents. You can't just turn your back on them." I answered briefly, firmly. I turned my back a long time ago. That was their choice, not mine. Then I hung up, giving no one the chance to sway my resolve. I knew that if I gave in even once, everything would return to the way it was, and I would be drained all over again. I would never allow that to happen again. My silence was not indifference, it was a declaration. It said that I was no longer the old Lisa, the daughter who lived only to provide and endure. It said that I had chosen a different path, one where I was respected, where I was free. And that silence, for my parents, was the most bitter punishment of all. Because they could do nothing to break it, nothing to force me back. They had lost the financial machine they once took for granted, but more painfully, they had lost the chance to repair what they had broken. One night, as I sat in my apartment looking out at the city lights, a strange calm washed over me. I knew they were struggling on the other side, but I no longer felt guilt. I thought to myself, perhaps the sweetest revenge isn't shouting, nor staging some grand spectacle. The sweetest revenge is silence, letting them face the consequences of their own actions, while I keep walking forward on the road of success without ever looking back. And I smiled, because for the first time in years, I was truly free. I had promised myself that after everything shattered, I would hold a real celebration for myself. Not to boast, not to seek anyone's approval, but simply to honor the new life I had chosen. So, on a Saturday evening, I opened the doors of my new apartment to the people who had stood by me through it all. The apartment glowed warmly with golden light, the dining table set simply yet elegantly with wine, cheese, and dishes my friends had each brought along. On the balcony, the breeze from the San Francisco Bay swept in, carrying the fresh scent of salt water. The guest list wasn't long. Just the faces who had seen me stumble, and the ones who had lifted me back up when I thought I couldn't stand again. There were colleagues who had stayed with me through sleepless nights at the office, a few friends from Stanford who had encouraged me in my most exhausted days, and my thesis advisor, the one who told me I had leadership potential even when I didn't yet believe in myself. They walked into my home with bright smiles, hugging me tightly, as if they too were proud of everything I had achieved. The evening was filled with laughter. We sat gathered around the table, recalling funny memories, sharing plans for the future. One colleague raised his glass and said, "Lisa, I watched you face crushing pressure, and yet here you are today, successful, strong, and happy. I think if anyone deserves to be celebrated, it's you." Applause broke out, warm and genuine. I looked around the room, feeling the glow in every pair of eyes. Not a single person compared me to anyone else, not a single word diminished me, not a single look carried contempt. There was only recognition, respect, and real affection. In that moment, the memory of my MBA graduation dinner resurfaced like a shadow-heavy silence, cold stares, venomous curses, all of it in stark contrast to what I was living now. And I realized that perhaps I had lost one family, but I had found another, a family I had chosen for myself. A family that wasn't bound by blood, but who stood by me when I was weak, lifted me when I fell, and celebrated with me when I triumphed. As the laughter began to fade, I stood up, a glass of wine in my hand. The room grew quiet, every eye turning toward me. I took a deep breath and said, my voice trembling yet steady, "Some of us are not fortunate enough to be born into families that truly value us. I was once belittled, constantly compared, even cursed with the words that I should never have existed. But tonight, I stand here to say this. Family is not defined by blood. Family is the people who choose to stand by you, who lift you up, who love you without condition. I may have lost one family, but I have found a real one." A wave of applause filled the room, long and heartfelt. A friend came forward, hugged me, and whispered, "You deserve all of this." I smiled, tears welling in my eyes, feeling my heart filled for the first time in years. Not with the recognition of my parents, but with the unconditional love of the people I had chosen to call family. That night, after everyone had left, I sat alone by the window, gazing out at the glowing city. I thought back to everything from my childhood years of constant comparison, to that bitter graduation dinner, to the decision to cut ties, to the months of pouring myself into my career. I realized that every wound, every loss, every night I cried alone had led me here. I was no longer the girl who only knew how to endure. I had become a woman who was strong, free, and happy. If you are listening to this story and have ever been belittled by your own family, remember this: your worth is not defined by them. They may diminish you, they may deny you, but that does not make you any less valuable. Only you have the right to decide who you are and what you deserve. Sometimes, cutting ties with a toxic relationship is the only way to grow and to be free. And when you do, you'll realize there is another family waiting for you, not one of blood, but one of love and choice. Believe in your own strength. Believe that you are worthy of love. And one day, like me, you will sit surrounded by people who call you family not because they have to, but because they truly want to. Thank you for listening.